Far to the south of Middle-earth lie the sunlands of Harad. They are enormous, exotic, and thoroughly enigmatic. They are also, from the perspective of the people who write the histories, a land of enemies, soldiers in the service of Sauron. So why is that the case? How did it become that way? What do we know about the mysteries of Harad? Maya Govan and Melanine, and welcome to another episode of Tolkien Untangled. Now, there is a whole video's worth of interesting things to say about the Haradrim who marched out of Harad and fought long wars against Gondor in the Third Age, but they are not what this video is going to be about. Instead, right now, I want to focus on the region of Harad itself, the land, its inhabitants, its history, and its mysteries. And I suppose the first thing to say about Harad, that is not what the people living there would have called it. Harad is a Sindarin word meaning south. It was used by the people who lived to Harad's north and west. We are told almost nothing about the languages of Harad itself, and we are never given any names for what the many different Haradrim might have called their different countries. But we can be sure it wasn't Harad. And we can be sure Harad isn't one nation. It's an enormous swathe of land that's pretty much unexplored by the people that most Middle-earth stories are about. From the perspective of the Northmen and the men of the West, the Dunedain, the South is a land of sun, heat, and inscrutability. It's a place where even the stars themselves are strange. There is a vast, varied, and powerful continent-sized landmass down there, but all we know of it are tantalizing stories told by strangers to its shores. Anyway, I will talk about the people of Harad, the Haradrim, in just a few minutes, but first I want to focus on the natural history of this land. Like, what exactly is Harad? Well, according to the people living in the north, the south can be split into near Harad and far Harad. Neither region is particularly well defined, but near Harad seems to be an arid area directly to the south of Gondor, Mordor, and Khand. In the Third Age, it's home to the people who had the greatest conflict with the Dunedain, and the most direct contact with Sauron. I guess what we think of when we think like quintessential Haradrim are probably the people of near Harad. And here's a fun fact, although we know very little about this land, we can be 99% positive that the deserts of near Harad are populated by camels. Camels are not the first animal one typically thinks of when imagining Middle-earth, but in 1969, 4 years before he died, Tolkien collaborated with an excellent mapmaker called Pauline Baynes to produce an official poster map of Middle-earth. And on that map, above the words near Harad, there is an illustration of a camel. Furthermore, in Quenya, the language of the High Elves, there is a perfectly wonderful word for camel, which proves that they definitely do exist in Middle-earth. In Quenya, they are called Ulumpe. Which, isn't that just the most fantastic sounding word for camel? Ulumpe. And it might imply, at some point in Middle-earth's past, some elf of the uttermost west once encountered a camel and gave it that name, presumably somewhere in near Harad. First contact between a high elf and a camel is a very curious, but also, imagination-inspiring thing to think about. But, unfortunately, perhaps, I think it's probably much more likely that the camels of near Harad got their Quenya name not from some high elf, but from early Númenórean explorers in the Second Age, who originally used Quenya as their language of law and learning, kind of like how many scientists today use Latin. We also know there are elephants in this part of the world, and we know that the Sindarin-speaking Dunedain called these elephants Anabon, or in Quenya, Undamunda, which is also, I think, an excellent linguistic encapsulation of an elephant's size, strength, and majesty. We also know Harad was home to serpents, but by far its most notorious animal is, of course, the mumak, known to hobbits as an oliphant. Mumakil are epic. They are described as having vast bodies bigger than houses, with legs like trees. Their leathery skin makes them pretty much impervious to arrows, and when they are arrayed for war, they are perhaps the most brutally effective battlefield beast ever to exist in the Third Age. Their only weak spots seem to be their eyes, and so to bring one down, archers must stand their ground as the mummak charges towards them before pulling off an astonishing shot. This is made even more difficult by the fact that horses are naturally terrified of mumakil and will always try to avoid them, so just getting close to one is incredibly challenging even for a skilled rider. The other way one might kill a mummak is by breaking its body with a stone cast from a catapult. Which is quite a messed up thing to imagine, really, but we know that did happen at least once during the Siege of Gondor. Before moving on, though, I want to take a moment to speculate a little bit on the nature of the mumakil. In The Lord of the Rings, and in other Middle-earth writings, we see lots of examples of evil animals actively aligning themselves with various evil powers. For example, the wolves, who ally with the orcs in the Battle of the Five Armies, or the vampire bats that also fight in that battle, or the Krebine, who work as spies, or the fell beasts that the Nazgûl ride. And in those cases, honestly, I don't have too much sympathy for these evil creatures. They are enemy combatants, and they chose to align with the obviously malicious agenda of a dark power. But I don't think that's true of the mumakil. I think they are just animals, forced into war by the Haradrim, but not actively aligned with Sauron. We are told in the very early First Age that Melkor, the original Dark Lord, also known as Morgoth, created monsters of horn and ivory that dyed the earth with blood. So it is possible the mumakil are vestiges of those primordial monsters, which would, I guess, make them at least partially evil, but I think that's highly unlikely. Melkor created those monsters in his fortress of Utumno, which exists right in the very north of Middle-earth, literally the other end of the map from the lands of the mumakil. And the fact that elephants exist in the south of Middle-earth suggests, at least to me, the mumakil are much more likely to be a subspecies of them, rather than a whole other monster of Melkor's from ages past. And so, I actually feel quite a lot of empathy for the mumakil. Elephants are very intelligent animals, so presumably the mumakil are too, and I find it really quite tragic to imagine these neutral creatures getting caught up in the horrors of Sauron's war. I mean, yes, the Battle of Pelennor Fields was very harrowing because of the mumakil, but it was also surely quite harrowing for the mumakil. I don't think any of them wanted to be there. And there's one mumak in particular that I find myself spending quite a bit of time thinking about. As you know, when Frodo and Sam are hanging out in Ithilien, they both get their first glimpse of a real-life Oliphant. Then Faramir and his rangers ambush the Haradrim. The mumak breaks free, and in a panic he flees into the surrounding forest, trampling all people before him on both sides. Tolkien wrote, "On the great beast thundered, blundering in blind wrath through pool and thicket. Soon he was lost to view, still trumpeting and stamping far away. What became of him? Sam never heard." We are given a few options, including maybe he raged on until he plummeted into the river and perished far from his home. I guess that's the more depressing version, but it is also suggested perhaps he escaped and lived to roam the wild for a time. We'll never know, but I really like to imagine, after The Lord of the Rings, there is still one bad-tempered wild mumak living free in the forests of Ithilien. Maybe Faramir did see him again when he became the prince of that land. Maybe Legolas and the wood elves that he brings to Ithilien are also aware of him. Anyway, getting back to Harad, if one were to journey south over the river Harnen, cross the desert and pass through grassland, they would eventually arrive in what Gondorians call Far Harad, an even more mysterious part of the world. All we know of Far Harad is that here there are dense, dark forests in which apes can be found. There are elephants and mumakil. There is one reference in early writings to tawny cats of the southern lands, and there is a controversial line about half-trolls, or troll men, that can be interpreted in a couple of different ways. But I think this line really needs to be dissected in context. So, during the Battle of Pelennor Fields, after Theoden's death, Eomer leads the Rohirrim in a furious charge against the soldiers of Mordor. He overthrows a great many of his enemies, but then Gothmog, the lieutenant of Minas Morgul, flings into the fray Easterlings, Variags of Khand, and out of Far Harad, black men like half-trolls, with white eyes and red tongues. Now, it's very possible that there is no such thing as half-trolls, and these men of Far Harad are simply that, men. Excellent warriors of great stature who've marched a very long way to fight in the War of the Ring. Perhaps they are simply people who look very different from any men that Eomer's ever seen before, and so he kinda unfavourably compares them to some kind of half-troll. It is worth noting, the Rohirrim are not a worldly wise or learned people. Their culture lives through songs and oral traditions, but they do not write much down, and they do not study law. Their ancestors came from the north, they do not have access to knowledge beyond their borders, and they even consider the elves of relatively nearby Lothlorien to be sinister sorcerers who should be avoided. So I think we can very confidently speculate that no man of Rohan would have ever seen anyone from Far Harad before the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Therefore, I think it's very possible that this reference to half-trolls is simply Eomer's take on a group of fierce-looking enemies coming to kill him who hail from a very different part of the world than what he's used to. But it is also possible, perhaps, Far Harad is populated by some kind of half-man, half-troll monsters. We know Saruman spent a few years doing something unbelievably evil to the men of Dunland, and the wickedest deed of his entire existence was somehow mixing together the races of men and orcs to make half-orcs. So it certainly stands to reason that Sauron, who had thousands of years longer to work with, might have done something similar to the men of Far Harad, thereby creating some kind of half-troll creatures. We know that the Ologhai exist and were actually present at Pelennor Fields, and although we don't know anything really about their exact origins, we know they are intelligent, we know they're able to speak, they are tall, and they are clearly troll-like. Maybe they originate from Far Harad. Maybe, in addition to people, Far Harad is also populated by troll folk. Or maybe the men of Far Harad are simply very tall, very formidable warriors from a very distant country, the likes of which Eomer and the Rohirrim have never encountered before. There's really not any right or wrong way to imagine this, and both options are pretty cool, but they do imply something slightly different about what the southernmost parts of Middle-earth might be like. And, of course, these two options are not mutually exclusive, so if we choose to, we are all free to imagine great warrior men living alongside, and potentially coming into conflict, with intelligent half-trolls, far away in the tropics of Harad. Anyway, that's about all I have to say about the region's geography, so let's move on now to its history and the origins of the people who came to inhabit it. Back in Middle-earth's very beginning, there were no elves, no men, and no dwarves. The only quote-unquote people were the Valar and the Maiar, the divine spirits that built and ruled over the planet of Arda. They lit the world with two divine lamps, one of which, Oromar, stood in the south. In its beginning, the land that we now call Harad would have been bathed in divine golden light, and it was probably a pretty blissful place to be. Until Melkor reappeared and made everything awful. He cast down the great lamps, and in their ruin the land was burned. New seas were formed. Harad underwent sudden catastrophic change, and new coastlines formed as a result. Interestingly, this is not the last time that's going to happen. Anyway, after that, a lot of very cool things happen in the uttermost west, a lot of awful things happen in the north, where Melkor is, and in the primordial east, the story moves forward with the awakening of the first elves. As it goes, the first elves have quite a terrible time in the east because of the threat from the north, so they make a great journey into the west. But in the south, nothing changes. In Harad, animals do what animals do, and perhaps some unnamed Maiar explore the southern reaches of Middle-earth, but for the most part, the stories at the heart of the Elder Days, the First Age, have nothing to do with the south. Which brings us to an interesting question. Were there ever any elvish populations living in Harad? The short answer is we don't know, but there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever to suggest the answer might be yes. However, that doesn't necessarily mean a definite no. The first elves ever to exist all lived by the shores of their awakening in the far east. Then, a little under 2/3 of them began the great journey into the west, but just over a third refused the call and remained in their original eastern homeland. They are called the Avari. Now, we are never given any indication that this actually happened, but it's certainly possible. In the thousands of years that followed, maybe some of these Avari, or their descendants, might have decided to go on a separate great journey into the south. They would have had a long way to go, but it isn't inconceivable some of them could have eventually migrated into the sun lands of Harad. Alternatively, we could perhaps speculate there might have been some early sylvan elves, wood elves, who did begin the great journey into the west, but gave up on it when they encountered the vast woodlands to the east of the Misty Mountains, the forest that's going to go on to become known as Greenwood the Great, and then later, Mirkwood. Again, there is absolutely no evidence for this, but it is possible some of these sylvan elves might have followed the ancient and immeasurable forests south for centuries, until eventually they found themselves dwelling among the trees of a southern jungle, the tropics of far Harad. But as I say, apart from wishful thinking, there really isn't any actual reason to believe that's the case. What we can speculate on, though, with a little bit more promise, is the possibility of dwarven communities in Harad. There are 7 different dwarf clans in Middle-earth, but almost nothing is known about 4 of them. All that can really be said is that they are known as the Iron Fists, the Stiffbeards, the Blacklocks, and the Stonefoots, and they dwell somewhere in the east. I would posit probably 2 of these 4 eastern clans live in the southeast, or East Harad. This is, again, mostly speculation. I don't want to imply dwarves of Harad are like a definite fact or anything. Maybe only men live in the south. But in an early map of primeval Middle-earth, Tolkien drew 2 great mountain ranges in the east, the Red Mountains, or the Orakani, in the northeast, and the Yellow Mountains in the southeast. We're never told any specific details about where the eastern dwarves awoke, but the Red Mountains do seem like the likeliest bet, and although the Yellow Mountains don't appear on any future maps, I certainly do think it's possible 2 of the 4 eastern clans maybe built their first dwellings in some southern mountain range. Perhaps in the millennia that followed, they traded dwarf-forged goods with the local Haradrim. Perhaps some of them joined Sauron in the War of the Last Alliance. Or perhaps when evil rose in the south and the east, many of them fled to Khazad-dûm, or the Blue Mountains in the west. Or perhaps there were no dwarves in the south, we just don't know. But before I move on, if there were 2 dwarven clans in eastern Harad, that would mean one day there will be 2 rings of power in Harad. There will be 2 dwarven treasure hoards in Harad, and almost certainly those treasure hoards would be among the 4 that were plundered and devoured by dragons. So, if we do choose to imagine dwarves in the south of Middle-earth, we should also probably imagine their conflict with southern dragons. Something that, again, we know absolutely nothing about, but is very cool to speculate on. Anyway, what we can discuss in much greater detail are the men of Harad, the Haradrim. Just like the first elves, the first men awoke in the mysterious far east. The first thing they saw was the sun rising in the west. Yes, the sun used to travel in the opposite direction through the sky, and the first men followed its light. Just like the elves, a great many of them journeyed west and occupied new lands, but a great many of them also stopped before arriving anywhere near the western shore. This means the oldest Manish communities in Middle-earth can all be found in the east, in Rhûn. And relatively early on in their history, some of those Easterlings journeyed south and became the ancestors of the first Haradrim. However, there is a very important point to make here. I know that in The Lord of the Rings, the Haradrim are presented as villains. They are wicked men in the service of Sauron. But The only Haradrim we ever meet are the warriors who left Harad to fight against Gondor. We never get to see any Haradrim civilians in their own homeland. And B, until a good whack of time into the Second Age, Harad was not a place under any kind of shadow. In fact, in the First Age, while the men of Beleriand in the north were busy either resisting the Dark Lord Morgoth or being enslaved by him, the south was probably one of the safest, loveliest, and most salubrious places in Middle-earth to build a civilization. I imagine, while the men we know from the Silmarillion were living quite horrendous lives really, and getting caught up in the cataclysmic War of the Jewels, the men of Harad were enjoying some sort of golden age. They're building nations in the virgin lands of the south. There are probably no orcs in this part of the world yet. Certainly there's no Dark Lord yet. There are no Númenóreans causing problems. There's no Gondor to go to war with. There's just a powerful sun, vast swathes of country, and a whole host of exotic creatures inhabiting it. If you were a Middle-earth time traveller, I do think Harad in the First Age would be an underrated but highly enjoyable holiday destination. However, that said, we can be quite confident there would not have been any kind of beachfront infrastructure. We are explicitly told the first mortal man ever to behold the Western Sea is a guy from Beleriand, and he didn't do that until 95 years before the end of the First Age, so I think we can be pretty much certain there were no coastal Haradrim back then. What Tolkien does tell us, though, in this early period, west, north, and south, the children of men spread and wandered, and their joy was the joy of the morning, before the dew is dry, when every leaf is green. Isn't that just such a lovely way to imagine the first Haradrim? Anyway, 95 years after that guy in Beleriand looked at the Western Sea for the first time, everything changed again. The First Age came to a dramatic end, and vast areas of land were drowned in the following cataclysm. In the northwest, it's utterly apocalyptic, but in the southwest, it's a big deal too. Once again, the coastline of Harad is changed. New harbours emerge, and previously habitable land sinks beneath the waves. The Second Age begins. And in the early Second Age, Harad is visited by early Númenóreans, hailing from an island nation far to the west. The conflict between the Haradrim and the Númenóreans, as well as their Dunedain descendants, is mostly what the Haradrim are known for, but even in the early Second Age, that conflict was not yet kindled. The early Númenóreans had wholesome and positive interactions with the Haradrim. The people of Harad benefited from the wisdom and lore of the Númenóreans. They learned new farming techniques, their skill at crafting advanced, and Harad began to see some of its earliest cities. In the first millennium of the Second Age, a particularly famous prince of Númenor called Aldarion went on many great sea voyages, exploring and discovering many parts of Middle-earth's coastline and journeying further than any Númenóreans before him. On one such voyage, he was almost killed in a shipwreck off the coast of Harad. And although it's not certain, it is likely that Aldarion was the first Númenórean to discover the southern bay of Umbar, which Númenóreans will, in the future, build into one of their largest, greatest, and most powerful colonies, the city of Umbar, which is destined to one day become the city of the Corsairs. However, although Aldarion was, in my mind, a good guy who made Middle-earth a better place by visiting it, there is a double edge to that sword. Melkor, obviously, dwelt in the north, but after he was overthrown at the end of the First Age, his chief disciple, Sauron, fled into the south. 500 years later, he began to stir. The shadow of his evil spread, and the local area fell under his dominion. For the people of Harad, this was a game-changing catastrophe. And we're actually told part of the reason why Sauron chose Mordor as his base is because of Aldarion. He knew Aldarion was an elf friend, a mighty captain, an heir to the throne, and therefore an extraordinary threat to his Dark Lord ambitions. So Sauron intentionally built his stronghold in the south, away from the sea but close to the lands of the non-Númenórean Haradrim. And thus, in the Second Age, the unfortunate people of Harad found themselves caught between two extraordinarily potent powers, the forces of Mordor and the forces of Númenor. This conflict is going to define pretty much everything we know of the Haradrim's history right up until the crowning of Aragorn and the destruction of the One Ring 6,000 years later. But this story is a lot more complex than just Sauron corrupted the Haradrim fought the Númenóreans, and therefore the Haradrim turned into villains. Aldarion's great-great-grandson was a guy called Ciarán. And although Ciarán was a great and respected warrior who helped the army of Gil-galad in defeating Sauron following the death of Celebrimbor during the War of the Elves and Sauron, which is very cool, he was a much better fighter than a ruler. When Ciarán eventually did become king, he proved greedy for wealth, hungry for power, and oppressive to the people who got in Númenor's way. And then his son, King Artanamir, was even worse. During Artanamir's reign, Númenórean relations with the Haradrim soured massively. No longer did Númenóreans come to the south as friends and teachers. Now they were brutal conquerors. They demanded heavy tribute from the Haradrim, and they gave the Haradrim quite a few very compelling reasons to resent the Númenóreans. Over the centuries, and with a great deal of influence from Sauron himself, this resentment grew into hatred, and the men of the south became staunch enemies of the men of the west. During the reign of Artanamir's son, so Ciarán's grandson, the city of Umbar was fortified by the cruel king's men of Númenor, the Black Númenóreans, and it became a stronghold for their lordship over western Harad. It grew into a centre of Númenórean brutality, a bastion of the king's men, and it was probably the fortress in which much of Harad's plundered gold, metals, and gems were stored before being shipped back to Númenor. For a long while, Sauron didn't dare challenge the Númenóreans directly. He had already lost to them once, but by about 2/3 of the way into the Second Age, things were drastically changing. His rings of power were beginning to work. The Nazgûl emerged. A shadow fell over his enemies, and many of the men living in his dominion, the south and the east, slowly succumbed to his influence. With the Black Númenóreans causing problems on the west coast, the God King of Mordor seemed to many Haradrim like a worthy alternative. I'm certain there were some Southrons and Easterlings who resisted the Dark Lord and understood the nature of his deception, but those who did resist lived in constant fear of persecution from Mordor. By the 3rd millennium of the Second Age, many inhabitants of both Rhûn and Harad worshipped the Dark Lord and considered him their deliverer from the wickedness of the men of the West. In time, Sauron's dominion over the men of southern Middle-earth became so substantial, he started referring to himself as the Lord of all men, which for the King of Númenor was intolerable. In the year 3261 of the Second Age, the King of Númenor was a very important character called Pharazôn. And Pharazôn was many things, most of them bad, but he was at least a staunch enemy of Sauron's at first. When he caught wind that the Lord of Mordor had declared himself the Lord of all men, Pharazôn gathered the greatest Númenórean fleet ever assembled, and he sailed to Middle-earth with the most powerful army ever to march through it, at least since the High Elver Noldor arrived way back in the First Age. Pharazôn's Númenórean army is so mighty, in fact, that he marches it all the way from Umbar through Harad to Mordor's Black Gate without encountering any resistance. Then Sauron himself comes forth. He beholds the might of the Númenóreans, and he surrenders to them. He kneels at Pharazôn's feet, and he allows himself to be taken to Numenor as a prisoner. What follows is one of the most hardcore things in Tolkien's entire legendarium. Sauron can't bring down Numenor with, orcs and trolls, but he can bring it to ruin by offering advice. However, as astonishingly cool as this story is, it is only tangentially relevant to the Haradrim. While Sauron's in Numenor, he plays on King Pharazôn's all-consuming fear of death, and he ultimately manipulates many Numenorians into worshipping Melkor and performing human sacrifices in his name. Many of the people being sacrificed were faithful Numenorians who rejected Sauron and resisted the madness of their king Pharazôn. But his black Numenorians, the king's men, they also sacrificed, or I should say murdered, many men of Middle-earth too, who had the misfortune of living near Numenorian colonies, including many men of Harad. It's worth bearing this in mind, I think, when imagining the Haradrim during the War of the Last Alliance, or even the Haradrim of the Third Age. Yes, from Gondor's perspective, they are enemies, villains, and friends of Mordor. But from a Haradrim perspective, the Dunedain of the late Second Age literally kidnapped their countrymen, shipped them across the sea, and human sacrificed them as part of the most nefarious cult ever to exist on the planet of Arda. Under Sauron's guidance, King Pharazôn became the greatest tyrant the world has seen since the days of Melkor. So you can probably see why there's so much bad blood between the people of Harad and the descendants of Numenor in Gondor during the Third Age. However, this is where we get to see just how sinister Sauron's machinations really are. I won't go into detail on this, otherwise we'll be here all day, but ultimately, King Pharazôn and many of his followers find themselves imprisoned forever in a place called the Caves of the Forgotten, while the faithful Numenorians, the good guys who opposed him, are forced to flee to Middle-earth before the entire island of Numenor sinks beneath the waves, Atlantis-style. The faithful, under their new king, Elendil, established two new Dunedain kingdoms in Middle-earth, and the southern kingdom is ruled by Elendil's sons, Isildur and Anarion. It is built on Mordor's doorstep. It exists to keep watch over the Dark Land, it borders Harad, and it's called Gondor. The people of Gondor were enemies of Pharazôn, so you would think they might share some common cause with the Haradrim, who were also his enemies. But unfortunately, that's just not how Sauron's maneuvering works. Despite the fact that he was the one amplifying Pharazôn's most tyrannical tendencies, he's the one who performed the human sacrifices, Sauron still manages to convince the Haradrim that the Dunedain in Gondor are their true enemy. Which is very interesting because, despite Pharazôn's horrible fate and the destruction of much of his army, there were still plenty of black Numenorians living in Middle-earth after Numenor's downfall, mainly around Umbar. And considering how awful the black Numenorians were to the Haradrim, one might expect the Haradrim and the Gondorians to team up against their mutual enemy, but again, Sauron's spiteful influence does not allow for that. Instead, events are engineered so that the brutal black Numenorians ally with the Haradrim against the Gondorians. It has nothing to do with history, or logic, or even right and wrong. It's about Sauron ensuring his servants unite against his enemies, even if those servants should absolutely hate each other. This is what the Deceiver is best at. And we're actually told about a pair of black Numenorian lords living in Umbar towards the end of the Second Age, who rise to great power and authority over the Haradrim. Their names are Herumor and Fuinur, and although we know very little about their lives, they are excellent examples of how the Haradrim went from hating Black Númenóreans to serving them and fighting alongside them against Sauron's enemies. Which brings us at last to the end of the Second Age and the War of the Last Alliance. We know next to nothing about what role the Haradrim played in this war, but I think we can be confident many of them would have fought with Sauron against the Alliance. After the Dark Lord's defeat, though, things did begin to change in Harad. Its people were freed from Sauron's malignant influence, but the shadow of their history did not leave them. Their ancestral conflict with the men of the West did not disappear just because the Dark Lord did. In the early Third Age, the Black Númenóreans of Umbar intermingled with the neighbouring Haradrim, and over time, these two populations became increasingly indistinguishable. From the year 1000 onwards of the Third Age, war between Gondorians and Haradrim was a pretty regular occurrence, but as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, I don't really want to go into too much detail on those conflicts because they really do deserve a dedicated video of their own, and also they are more relevant to the history of Gondor than the mysteries of Harad. However, what I will say, there is no lasting peace between these two regions until the very end of the Third Age, after the ring is destroyed and Sauron is overthrown and Aragorn is crowned king. Thousands of years of animosity finally shift. In the Fourth Age, Umbar is subdued, and peace is forged between Aragorn's reunited kingdom and the people of Harad. Although, on occasion, King Elessar and his buddy King Éomer do ride together into Harad to maintain this peaceful coexistence. However, before I conclude this video, there's one more mystery of the South that I want to touch on. I've talked about elves and dwarves and men and mumakil and other creatures, but what about wizards? Did the Istari ever come to Harad? Well, we can be fairly confident that yes, at least one did. Though we can also be confident he wasn't there long and he wasn't welcomed warmly. Gandalf is the name that's given to the Grey Wanderer by the men of the North. Mithrandir is the name he's given by elves and men of the West. Tharkun is the name he's given by dwarves, but in the South, he is known as Incarnus. Now, Tolkien changed his mind a few times on what Incarnus means and which language it comes from, and depending on which version we go with, kind of determines whether South in this context means Gondor or near Harad. In one version, Incarnus is a Quenya word, meaning mind ruler, which implies this name was given to him by the descendants of Númenor. But in other writings, we are told Incarnus comes from one of the languages of Harad. Originally, it would have been Inkar Nush, and what these words mean are North Spy. That is basically everything we know about Gandalf's journeying into the far south, but this one fun fact does paint an interesting picture. Presumably, at some point he encountered a community of Haradrim, he was mistrusted by them, and he gained a reputation as a foreign agent in league with the powers to their north. And there's one more wrinkle in this potential storyline, because in writings from 1958 that are, to be honest, contradicted by some other writings, Tolkien tells us a few new details about the Blue Wizards. In most versions, the Blue Wizards travel into Rhûn and aid the Easterlings in resisting Sauron, but in Letter 211, Tolkien wrote, "I really do not know anything clearly about the other two wizards. I think they went as emissaries to distant regions east and south. What success they had, I do not know, but I fear that they failed, as Saruman did, though doubtless in different ways. And I suspect they were founders or beginners of secret cults and magic traditions that outlasted the fall of Sauron." So, maybe the reason these Haradrim mistrusted Gandalf and labelled him a North Spy is because they were firmly under the influence of another wizard, or wizards who'd fallen into darkness like Saruman. Maybe there were a pair of anti-Gandalfs working malice in Harad while he was busy guiding the peoples of the North and West. And what I find most fascinating about this detail is the fact that perhaps the wicked blue wizard's secret cults and magic traditions outlasted the fall of Sauron. That completely changes the note that this video ends on. If we go with this version, Sauron is defeated, Aragorn is crowned king, but evil still persists in the south. Maybe after the Dark Lord's downfall, the wicked blue wizards fill the vacuum he left behind, and they become new, malicious influences casting a new shadow over Harad. Perhaps before the south can be made wholesome again, there's one last war to be fought. As I say, these details only exist in one version, and that version is contradicted in other places. Also, Tolkien himself explicitly states he doesn't know what became of the Blue Wizards, but this is still a cool detail to think about. And to challenge what I just said there, in a note found in the Nature of Middle-earth, we are told that in the Second Age, Sauron's gathering of armies had not been unopposed, and his successes had been much less than his hope. But this is a matter spoken of in notes on the Five Wizards. He had powerful enemies behind his back, the east and in the southern lands, to which he had not yet given sufficient thought. So we are equally free to imagine perhaps the Blue Wizards were a positive force in Harad, uniting and inspiring the men of that land who resisted the Dark Lord. Like so much of Harad's history though, at the end of the day, it remains a mystery. Anyway, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to hit like and leave a comment and click subscribe to make sure you don't miss any future videos coming soon. You can also now support the channel on Patreon or on Ko-fi if you'd like to, so follow the links in the description to those pages if you are at all interested. However, until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Navair Melanin.